Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Digital Doc Interviews, where we talk to the people using video games to help have a positive impact on the world. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Digital Doc Games explores how games help us grow, connect, and heal. If you like what we are doing here, go ahead and hit that like or thumbs up button, and make sure to follow and subscribe to not miss out on any content. Some small housekeeping before we get started here. Remember that in order to learn more about accessibility in games, every Wednesday night at 8, 9 Central over at twitch.tv/digital.games, I am playing through The Last of Us Part 2 completely blindfolded. And of course, if you missed it, check out my interview with Ross Miner, a blind gamer, to hear how he plays games as a blind person and why accessibility is so important to him. Lastly, we just posted our impact review for the game Before I Forget. So before you watch this interview, make sure you go over and give that a watch, and then come right back here to hear from the creators of the game. And that is an excellent transition to introduce my guests, Chella Ramanan and Claire Morwood of Threefold Games. Hello, Chella. Hello, Claire.
Hello.
How are you guys?
Very impressed.
That's right. It's all about making that seamless, effortless transition. There's no script I'm reading from. It's all of it. So Chella and Claire, they serve as the creators and respectively the narrative designer and lead artist for the game Before I Forget, which is a wonderful 1-hour game about a woman with early onset dementia. And I thought an excellent way to not only experience a great story, but to experience the perspective of someone who lives with a very horrible but far too common disease that affects over 47 million people across the globe, and that is dementia. So guys, I'm really looking forward to hearing about what it was like creating this game, and you know, what you've seen to be the response so far. I know for me, it was a very powerful experience playing this game. So again, thank you guys for coming to chat with us.
Pleasure. Thanks for asking us.
The first question I have, you know, is when I think of a video game, you know, certainly it's a game exploring a woman who has dementia is not something that I've experienced before. How exactly did that come to be? Where did the idea to make a game about dementia originate from?
Well, we met at a game jam in Bristol, which is a city local to, well, Claire lived in Bristol and I lived near Bristol. And the theme was borders. And so I wrote fiction on the side. I was a sort of a journalist and a copywriter, and then I wrote sort of prose fiction, was always trying to write a novel. And I had this idea kicking around in my head. I kind of liked exploring the idea of memory and what it means, how it makes up who we are, what happens when we lose it. So I was always writing stories that explored that kind of aspect, and so I had this idea that was no more than a woman with dementia would be kind of cool to explore. So in the game jam, when we were kicking around a few different ideas, we were looking at sort of land borders. You know, it was around the time of the sort of Syrian refugee crisis and things like that. And then I said, well, I've got this idea about a woman with dementia, and you know, so it explores the internal borders, sort of mental borders, and yeah, that kind of sparked ideas, and yeah, we went with it. It just seemed to kind of be the perfect medium for that story, which I'd never written as prose because, you know, maybe it was waiting to be a game.
Right. And what was that like starting at a game jam, which for anyone who doesn't know, maybe you could even explain a little bit about what a game jam is.
Yeah, so a game jam is like normally over somewhere between a few hours to sometimes even like a few days to a week, but sort of, you know, then it becomes more of a part-time thing. And it's, I guess, like a competition where you form a team, or sometimes you work by yourself, and then there's normally this sort of overall theme. Like Chella said, ours was borders, and then your sort of goal is to try and make a game, just normally like a small prototype or a little demo or something, within the time frame that you've got with the people that you've met. So for us, that was the first time that we've met.
Wow.
And yeah, which was, because I guess like in the game jam, like you're kind of it's very like everything's kind of happening all at once. Like you're meeting new people, and then you're trying to like make a new thing, and it's all very exciting. So there's like a lot of energy around. It's like a really nice atmosphere. I guess it's probably similar to if you have like a music jam. I guess when you're jamming with other musicians, it's like that kind of thing.
So how did that happen? I mean, it sounds like, Chella, maybe you had an idea, the theme was borders, maybe this could be something with a patient with dementia, and you're walking around. I mean, are you go, who likes dementia? And Claire, puts her hands up. How did that connection get started?
Well, we were kind of thrown together. So it was like, okay, the theme is borders, go and make teams. So everyone was kind of wandering around and mingling and things. And then the person who was organizing it, Constance Florio, she was like, oh, I have a programmer here. And she kind of pulled us together because she was managing it and could see that, teams were being formed and there were people kind of floating about. So we were thrown together as a team. We didn't choose each other in those terms at all, and that's when we started throwing around the ideas. I mean, I'd done sort of writing workshops and things before, and so I tend to kind of sift through my ideas before I go to a workshop, because I know they're going to throw something at us and expect us to produce ideas like on the spot, and I always get sort of like idea amnesia and just like freeze. And I think so I kind of sifted through in my mind like, oh, what's some things that I've had kicking around in notebooks or something. So I think that one was kind of top of my mind, and it fitted, which was great.
Right.
And it was just a question of, I suppose, it just, I don't know, Claire, like, do you have more memory of how it happened? It just seemed to spark ideas, didn't it? We were like...
Yeah, like you said before, we definitely had we were writing different ideas down, kind of brainstorming, and I think I remember it took like, we had a little while, maybe like an hour or two at the start, where we weren't quite sure what we were going to do, and we were just still sort of like talking and trying to figure it out a bit. But it did definitely feel like right when that idea, like you told us about that idea, and then we were thinking about like the mechanics and just like some simple ways of like how we might portray that. I think when we were initially talking, the first things we always said was it should be just like, I don't even know if we said it was going to be first person. I think we probably did.
Right.
So
right.
yeah,
And so
just very simple stuff like that.
Yeah, and obviously it resonated with everyone at the Game Jam as well. If I'm not mistaken, it went on to win the Audience Choice Award at the Game Jam. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
That must have been really exciting.
Yeah, it was because there was a judged award, so there were sort of industry professionals who judged, and they picked a different game, and so we were just sitting there, and then we weren't expecting to win anything at all, and then they said the name of our game, and I think it took us a few seconds to be like, oh, that's us. Right. Yeah, and it's really powerful when your peers see something, because they'd all been through that same experience over that day or two. So it was really sort of heartening and inspiring, and was the whole reason why we continued. And I'm almost certain we'd have just said, bye, it's really nice meeting you, good luck, and stuff like that. And it would never have, wouldn't have gone any further. So it was, one of those weird things that happens in your life.
So when you heard that your name, when you heard Before I Forget, or was it even called Before I Forget at the time?
Yeah.
So when you heard Before I Forget be called as the winner, it sounds like what you're saying is at that point you're like, okay, you know what? Let's continue to work on this. So that is not something that you went into the Game Jam expecting to do, to have another, 2-year commitment in making a game.
4 years. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was really nice. I think it just like made us realize that it was something that kind of resonated with people, and it was something that was sort of worth pursuing.
Right.
And yeah, we didn't obviously at that point we didn't know like how long it would take or what scale we were going to make it to. But we thought at least it'd be worth putting a little bit more effort to and seeing where we could go with it.
Absolutely. So when you had this idea, and during the game jam and then after the game jam, did you draw on any inspirations, any other stories that you had heard of, whether they be personal or fiction, whatever it is, from books, from movies, anything that helped you really understand how you wanted to represent a character living with dementia?
Yeah, I mean, definitely sort of our initial research, we turned to other forms of fiction. So there was a book that I'd actually bought it like the summer before or that summer or something, called Elizabeth is Missing, which is a kind of crime mystery, but the detective is a woman with dementia, and her friend Elizabeth is missing, and she's trying to find her, so she leaves notes to herself. And but it's first person, so it's quite an intimate sort of insight into her world.
Right.
And she's also sort of has agency, which was, so it was really inspiring because she is driving. It's not about her as a victim of her disease. It's her driving her own story because she has her own motivations, even if they're driven by misremembering things or sort of slipping into different times in her life and things like that. So that was really inspiring, and we have a little homage to that book in the game.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Is that like an Easter egg hunt, or are you allowed to say what it is?
Yeah, so if you read the book, yeah, because it's a really great book. It's really well written. It's lovely. And then there's a film called Still Alice, which is about an academic with early-onset dementia, and there were some interesting things in that. And in the scene with her diagnosis, her doctor says, because you are have high intelligence level, you've actually kind of masked your disease because you have lots of coping mechanisms, like ways that you could do, which was quite interesting and sort of kind of helped set the scene of how Sunita is still living alone, and lots of the ways she copes with things. So yeah, that was interesting. And then and then the research went on to another stage, which maybe Claire can talk about, which was when we had sort of medical expertise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was about a year or so into the project, I think, and we were thinking about, I guess we'd done this like research by ourselves, and we'd sort of like started thinking, should we like reach out to people, but then we kind of like happened to bump into someone at a games conference who worked for a charity called Gaming the Mind. Then kind of started a relationship with him and another doctor as well, where we would like have video calls and like chat about stuff, and they sort of gave us a lot of pointers on the narrative and like mechanics of the game, and sort of in terms of like just the accuracy of her symptoms and what she might be experiencing. And then we sent them builds of the game, and they would play it and give their feedback, which was just like invaluable. It was amazing to have that, that kind of expertise, and just things that we, for all the research that we would have done, probably never would have picked up on.
Right. Did anything surprise you, in particular, that you could think of some of the feedback you received that you would have not thought of without it?
Yeah, there was one really like subtle thing that they picked up on, which was just the way that one of the lines was written, which was about Sunita picks up a key and she has forgotten the word for key, but so she describes it as oh, this like shiny metal object. And then the doctors said that it's much more likely that she would remember the function over the form of the object. So she would maybe say something like, oh, the unlocking thing rather than the shiny metal thing. Just in the way that people's memories work for objects, which was really interesting.
And that highlights just how careful you both were in designing this game to make it a true representation of what it may be like for someone to live with dementia. So I think that's really, really incredible. So thank you for taking that extra step and talking to those professionals. It absolutely shows in the final game. So, Chella, you say that you had inspiration from a book, from a film, but you and Claire were making a video game. Could you speak to specifically what is it about the medium of games that you feel was best deserving of Sunita's story?
Well, I think there's quite a few things. So, I mean, obviously it's an interactive medium, so you are playing as Sunita. So it's, the first person view, which you don't really get in films. You get the first person sort of in a book, but you're sort of, it's inhabiting a 3D space and experiencing it through that person's eyes. And then there's also the sort of level of experiencing Sunita as a narrator, an unreliable narrator. So her thoughts sometimes confuse your own experience of the space and what timeline you're in, and what you thought you understood about that other room or something like that. So so one of the things that we leaned into was playing with the idea of power and sort of player agency and the sort of power fantasy that games promise players. We've been led to believe that in games we progress from a state of low skill, and by the end we're higher skilled and we're very powerful and we become more competent. But of course with dementia the opposite is true, that that arc is in reverse. So we played around with those ideas of the power fantasy, and also the idea of confusion. So one of the things as a game designer that you don't want to do is confuse the player. You want to sort of have clear goals and sort of things like that. So there's sort of sequences in the game where we play around with that, and sort of player frustration, more than confusion, is frustration. You don't want the player to rage quit.
Right. We've all done it. But...
Yeah, exactly. We all have. But dementia is frustrating. And so there are sequences where we could, when we did play tests, we took it to shows, we could see gamers are used to winning, and they were trying to figure out this. You could see they were like, oh, this isn't going the way I want it to. I thought I'd done the right thing, and they'd come away and say, oh, so is there a way so how do you figure that out in time or whatever? And I was like, well, you don't, because she has dementia, and so sometimes you just don't win.
Right.
Never win at dementia. So.
And I could see how that could be a difficult thing for a gamer or someone who plays video games to come to terms with. Right? I mean, that's backwards, right? And I don't want to jump too quickly to some of the details of the game. I want to save that for the end. So I want to clearly mark a spoilers territory zone so everyone knows. Go play it before you continue on with the interview. Before we get there, Given that it does kind of challenge what a game is traditionally thought of, it made me think, and I've been thinking a lot over the course of this channel, the term video game in 2020 means something so different than it did in 1983 when Space Invaders and when arcades were the hot thing. Do you feel that the term itself is something that is still fitting? Is there a better term to explain experiences like before I get to people?
That's difficult.
This was my philosophical question of the day.
I guess it kind of depends maybe what you're trying to achieve when you're using the words. Like because we would often we call Before I Forget a video game because we want it to be seen as video game, because we want to show that video games can be broader than maybe what they are currently. But then I think if you're trying to tell someone or sort of explain to someone, I don't know, I feel like, because there's things like interactive experiences and stuff, which maybe
right.
If you're trying to sort of get someone who doesn't play a lot of video games to play it, and you're trying to sort of maybe show that games can be more artistic, then maybe that would be a better word. So I don't know, it's a bit of a vague answer, but I think it kind of depends on the context.
I think for me personally, I'd rather broaden the idea of what a video game is rather than redefining games like ours as something else.
Right. And that is something that I've heard in other interviews that you guys have done, that this was a creation that you guys made that, just like you're saying now, you always intended to be a video game. I've heard people ask you in the past if this is something that you wanted to be, used as an educational tool. But it sounds like that was really important to you, to make sure that this was seen as a game that anyone could pick up and play and experience the story.
Yeah, absolutely. It was something we kind of we didn't fight against exactly, but we were met with this reaction that because this is a serious topic that people can relate to the real world, it's a very concrete and sort of topical issue, and it's a healthcare issue, that it can be used as a training tool, or that it's for schools or the care system. I mean, great if they want to use this video game to help in those areas, that's great, but this is not what it's, it is what it is for its own sake.
Right. And that's the beautiful thing, right? I mean, it can exist in both areas. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, certainly for me, I'll just tell you right now, in medical school, I treated dozens and dozens of patients with dementia. And actually, some of them were actually probably my favorite patients to connect with. But I never felt like I understood them as much as I do now after playing Before I Forget. So it exists in both.
Oh,
wow. So going back to the medium of a video game and why that is something special for Before I Forget, something that I was really blown away with, which starts right in the beginning of the game, is how the art design is used for environmental storytelling, and how even the environment that you explore tells the story of a woman with dementia. So Claire, could you tell us a little bit about how you approached the art for Before I Forget? Obviously, I'm thinking of how the color bleeds into the world and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we had in there from the game jam, I think, with the color spreading. So I guess we were talking about it in the game jam, and I was thinking about what we could do that would be, I'm always quite big on having big visual metaphors and stuff like that. So I was like, what can we do to kind of really represent, as well as the text coming in to show her thoughts, how can we represent that visually as well, to show that there's these moments of lucidity and moments where she's has remembered something, as opposed to the rest of the time where really she's walking around this place that she in the past would have been very familiar with, but now she just doesn't recognize most of it. And the sort of color seems just the obvious way to do that, and one of the most visually striking ways that we could have done that, and having things that fade in the same way that her memories at times are kind of fading in and out.
Right.
So yeah, and then I think as well with there's not like a lot of, we've kind of purposely made it empty-ish in the house, but everything that is there is quite intentional. So we work together a lot on the environmental storytelling side of it, and about what sorts of objects would be in the house, and the placement of them, and that kind of thing. Because I guess it's kind of a real crossover between the art and the narrative side of the game.
Right, and I mean, the game never tells you, thinking about tutorials and things like that, the game never tells you that this is a game about dementia. You understand that very quickly based on the environment. I think one of the first things that made me realize it is right when you walk out of that initial room where you find your glasses in the beginning of the game, you walk down to the end of that corridor and you see a calendar, and there's a little Post-it note right next to it, I think, that says today, and points to the date. And that did it for me. I was like, I understand. This person needs reminders.
Yeah.
And those Post-it notes I thought were incredibly utilized in the design of the game. Sorry, I'm like fanboying out a little bit, but no, they were, and it was such an interesting way, because that's something that I'm sure is very realistic, and that is used, and I know it is, that is used to help people who live in their own homes with dementia. And it was interesting to see how clearly Sunita has written some of these Post-it notes for herself as a reminder, but it also seemed like caregivers written some of the Post-it notes. I may have even picked up, I'm not sure if it was actually intended to be like this, but maybe there were some different color Post-it notes that were left by her husband. There was one humorous one almost, that when she went into the kitchen, that said like, buy more peaches. And then there's another Post-it note that said, no more peaches. So I thought that was very well done. Can you talk about, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think we kind of, because we wanted the game to be quite short, and then we wanted to make sure that, I guess there was a balance between the text that you see that's in her thoughts and then the text that's in the environment, so that you're not like overloaded with text as well. Then we definitely like used the environment a lot in that way to like just fill in a lot of the blanks, and also like raise questions as well.
Right. Yeah. The game is a mystery game, and that definitely adds sort of to the eerie nature of what's happening and where her husband is and what's happening in this house. I would love to hear about the music, because the music is also, just like the art design is so important to portraying how Sunita's memories are coming back. The music is too. Can you talk about how that journey to create that soundtrack came to be?
Yeah, so the music was composed by a friend of mine, Dave Tucker, he did music on a radio play I did, and we were kind of struggling. So I had quite a solid idea of the sort of sound that I wanted. I wanted this sort of, there's a composer called Ludovico Einaudi who composes for piano, plays the piano, and I wanted that kind of sound, and we were sort of struggling to find that. And Dave had written this really beautiful short piece for this radio play, and so then I was like, oh, Dave, would it be okay if we like adopted that piece of music? Could you expand it, or can we just use a snippet or something? He's like, oh, I'll write a new one if you like. Wow. And and so he sort of goes away over the weekend and then comes, and we were like, oh my god. When when sort of Dylan's theme, we call it, sort of hits, because the game is very quiet. It's just ambient noise up until there's no sort of soundtrack, and until you your first encounter with Dylan, because basically Dylan is represented by the music. That's pretty much his character. And so that moment when you first hear those few notes on the piano, and it's sort of minor key and very sort of plaintive kind of tune, and really every time it kind of gets me right there. Dave did a brilliant job, and then of course we were like, could you write? And so then he sort of just came on as the composer.
Right.
We'd like more music, please.
Right. I'm glad he did, because it was very powerful. I'm going to mark this the point that we are going to transition. I'll wave my hands real big. Spoiler territory for before I forget. Let's talk about the end scene. I have in my notes, just because I feel like I have to tell you in one of my questions, I want to make sure to ask you. Let's talk about the end of the game. Holy crap. That's what I written down. There's a scene when Sunita finally realizes what's happening, and that she has, I would say, probably comes to terms at that point that she is forgetting that she's sick, and that Damien, who she's searching all around, Damien, her husband, died. Or maybe it's actually right before she figures that out. You go down this ever-expanding hallway as she's figuring this out, with this red light, illuminating the path in front of you. Newspaper articles are on the side of the hallway. If you look up close, saying that renowned composer and musician Damien died in car crash. All these things are coming back to her at once, and that soundtrack is booming. And I swear I have cried in a video game twice in my life. One has been, they've both been in 2020. One has been during The Last of Us Part 2, and one was during Before I Forget. And that scene was unbelievable. So that, what was it like when you heard that music for the first time?
Oh my God, it was, because getting to the ending, poor Claire, because getting the ending right, oh my gosh, that was hard.
A lot of
iteration. Poor Claire, she'd do a build, and I'd be like, oh cool, you put this in and you put that in, and it's really great, and then I'd be like, but the ending doesn't work. And I don't know why, and we need to do, and then we sort of had a weekend kind of breakout, because we did a lot of this remotely from each other, but then we'd have a couple of weekends at my house, and we would get so much done, and the hallway scene was something that we worked out in one of those weekends, wasn't it? And and then once we'd kind of like put that hallway in, the living room still wasn't done at that point, but the hallway the hallway was. And then we were like, oh, and then Dave could write some music, and he did. When the music came, it was like, wow, cool,
unbelievable,
perfect,
right? Because the whole game has been this melodic, minor, soft, soundtrack, and then it just hits you as she's remembering these things.
We sort of, I guess we kind of always needed. It was more that we just needed a way to get her to the living room, was why the hallway is even there in the first place. So because we always had it that the ending was going to be in the living room, but we hadn't really we had it I guess written, and we knew what was going to happen, but it wasn't implemented until pretty close to the end. But it was like, okay, we know we've got to get her there, but it was difficult to think of a way of doing that without just saying, okay, to the player, now go to the living room, because at that point you have explored most of the house, and there is probably this door that you haven't been in, but I don't think most people take much notice of it because it's very dark inside. It doesn't really necessarily look like somewhere. I don't know, maybe you had a different experience, but I think a lot of people kind of forgot about it. And then before that point, she's well, we wanted to have her like starting from the closet in the bedroom where all the newspapers are as well, so that if you hadn't had a chance to read those, then you would definitely have read those and made sure that you kind of had that background in your head as well.
Right.
So we just sort of in the end, after like experimenting a bit, decided let's just like remove every other room and let's make it like super clear, and especially because it's like this point in the game where she's having so much kind of like coming towards a clarity and just like focus on what she's wants to do at that point. We just made sure that like, because the rest of the game didn't really matter almost at that point, or the rest of the house didn't matter.
Right. So was the living room past the black hole in the middle of the hallway?
Yes.
It was. Okay. Yeah. So that's really interesting. So there's this in the beginning of the game, and for a large part of the game, this black hole that prevents you from, like on the floor, and Sunita is scared to go down that hallway because of this ominous black hole. Could you talk about designing, because that's the only thing I would say in the game that it's almost like a hallucination. That's something Sunita is seeing that you realize is really not there. There's not really a black hole in her house. So why was that chosen?
It was actually because we talked to someone who was a care worker at the first games convention that we took the game to, and we had all these rugs in the game that were just sort of decoration on the floor, which we were just like, oh, we just need to put something there, it doesn't really matter what it is. And then she played it and she said, oh, like you couldn't really have a rug like that on the floor because the pattern with someone who's got dementia, often they have can get visual hallucinations, and sometimes if there's something that's too like patterns on the floor, they might trip over because they think it's a hole, or they don't see it quite as it is. So it was just from that conversation really that we kind of looked into that a bit more, and then thought, well, maybe we should be maybe showing some of these like hallucinations as well as the kind of the memory loss side of it as well, to make sure we're kind of like getting a broad range of the symptoms in. So yeah, that's when we decided to put in this like rug that's actually a hole that you can't go past, but then acts as a kind of game mechanic in a sense as well, because it blocks off that later part of the game. And then I thought, well, if it's going to be like a hole in the floor and she's a cosmologist, just make it into like a black hole, and I don't know if it ties in some of that stuff.
Yeah, I didn't think of that, but that's really neat. I mean, that's really interesting to hear that it was grounded in something about the illness itself, but also, like you said, served as a game mechanic as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because nobody really understands what that is, why she's seeing that. They just kind of, if they're gamers, they immediately understand that it means that we don't want them to go down there. If they're not gamers, they sort of persist and are kind of confused, but then they get it. But the one person who completely understood is a colleague. His father has early-onset dementia, and so he played before I forget. And he was like, "Oh, yeah." So he had my colleague sent notes that he'd written back, his little commentary on the game. He's like, "Oh, she's on the same medication as me." It's like I didn't say what her dosage is and stuff like that. And then he's like, "Oh yeah, the rug." He's like, "Oh yeah, a lot of people." He's like, "I don't get that, but a lot of people do." And I felt sort of really validating that the only person who sort of looked at that and went like, "Oh yes," was someone with dementia, which was, that's like their sort of private moment of kind of representation. I suppose it's that moment of being represented.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I had that moment when I saw the medication as well. I was like, they've done the research. This is a proper medication. One interesting thing that I thought I really am curious to ask you. At the end of the game, and a couple points during the game, I started to wonder, are you guys hinting, or is the story hinting that her dementia is in some way a blessing. And first time I thought it was when I saw the black hole. And when that started to make sense to me, it's like, she's actually having a cognitive projection that's protecting her from pain. And then when the story unraveled and I saw that her husband actually is dead, I started thinking, was her whole dementia, at least a part of it, protecting her in that way? Is that something you guys thought of?
I mean, it's not something that we discussed sort of consciously, but it's something that I've thought about when, one of the things that we did discuss and were conscious of was that it wasn't just, oh, isn't it awful? Isn't it sad that this woman is a victim of dementia? And, we wanted to portray a whole person, not just a person with a disease, and the disease is the sort of overarching thing. So we were very conscious of, who is Sunita? Like, what does she like? Is she bossy? Is she, all these things. So she's very much a real person. As we developed the character a lot, and we talked about her a lot, and Dylan, and how they met, and all those things. But yeah, whenever I watched documentaries or read things about dementia, I kind of thought about how the sadness is for the people who are being left behind, who see this person who maybe changes personality, maybe doesn't remember who they are, or thinks they're someone else, or but sometimes for them they're in a happy place. Sometimes they're sort of they have peace, maybe. Right. Because when we're with Sunita, some of the memories she has are extremely happy, sort of childhood memories and things. So her reality isn't tragic. Right. It's our perception of her losing the reality we share with her that's kind of sad and tragic.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that. I wanted to talk about two more scenes. The first one, which would probably be right under that ending as the most impactful scene for me, was the bathroom scene. So there's a scene where Sunita, you're playing the game, walking around her house, and suddenly she says out loud that she needs to use the bathroom. So as the player, at least in my playthrough, I've come across the bathroom before. I've seen it. I've been in there. I remembered which door led to the bathroom, and so I quickly went over to that door. And all of a sudden, it opens, and you go in, and you're not in the bathroom. You're in this closet that I thought was on the other side of the hallway. And basically, you try again, back in the closet. I'm like, okay, what's going on here? You try another door, back in the closet. You never find the bathroom. That was really interesting thing to play, because here you are doing this mundane, basic human function activity, and that is becoming a core, mission or part of the game. What was it like designing that bathroom scene? Is that something that you had thought of early on, or is that something that came a little bit later?
It was fairly early. It was certainly within, it was in our original demo, which was the thing that we worked on for like the first couple of years of development, really. So I want to say it was definitely within like the first 6 months to a year of when we were working on it.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. It was definitely a lot of iteration to get it right. It was a real balance between, I guess, like what Chella was saying earlier, with the kind of like frustration of the player versus like the frustration of the character, and making sure that if you're playing it, you don't get so frustrated and confused in yourself that you just sort of think, I'm not enjoying this, like, because it's punishing, or I'm not, that kind of thing. We needed the players to sort of like be confused, but then to sort of like at the end understand why they were confused, and because it was Sunita's confusion and frustration. But we played around a lot with like how many doors you go through, and if it should be like a kind of random number or if it's always the same number, and like that kind of thing, and exactly how what triggers it.
Right.
Yeah, and then also it's kind of an interesting use of video games have bathrooms in them quite often, and sometimes you can just turn on the tap, and sometimes you can look in the mirror and get a jump scare or something. Horror games love like grungy bathrooms.
Right.
So in terms of sort of the language of games, it was a different way to use a bathroom, because it was, you know, as you say, a completely banal, functional thing that we do every day, and you know, it's a really awful, humiliating part of dementia. You know, so it was in all the things I read. It was a theme that came up again and again. So I thought it was important for us to represent that experience, and it also then plays with expectations of game spaces and what bathrooms are for in games.
Right. Yeah, and it's a great example again of using the video game medium, that interactivity that it provides to throw the player off and to really immerse them in Sunita's mind, I would say. How you kind of play with time and space. The other time that I experienced something similar to the feeling that I got with the bathroom scene, of sort of disappointed in myself as a player, but also disappointed, you know, feeling Sunita's disappointment, was when she went to the kitchen, and the goal was, you know, she was going to fix herself lunch, and she ended up deciding that she didn't like what was in the refrigerator, so she didn't end up having lunch. And I'm wondering if this was something specific to my playthrough or if this was scripted. I don't think it was. But you leave the kitchen, and a little bit later in the game, you come back to the kitchen. When I came back to the kitchen, the refrigerator door was open. And I interpreted that, at least, that I forgot to close the refrigerator door. And at least for me, I didn't close the refrigerator door. And I felt so bad and embarrassed that I felt, and I'm like, I screwed it up. Her sandwich is ruined.
Everything's ruined. That's so cool. I love that.
Isn't that like the great power of video games? So it's like you can have all these interpretations, and who knows if they were scripted or not, you know, like stuff that you would find, and then you just kind of like make your own narratives about it.
Yeah. And in that moment, I was like, yeah, I mean, this is just how Sunita would have felt, that she forgot and I forgot.
Yeah, that's so cool.
So, I don't even want you to answer me if it was scripted or not, because I'm going to continue believing that it was me.
That we're brilliant. I'm happy for you to continue that.
There we go. Guys, thank you so much for coming and talking with me today. I again, it was the second game of 2020 and the second game of my life to bring tears to my eyes. And I know you say it wasn't meant for a game for education, but whether it was or not, it has value for a lot of different types of people. You talked about just general gamers who want to experience a new perspective. You talked about people who live with dementia, people with family members with dementia. From my perspective, I think every single medical student, every single doctor should download this game. It's 1 hour. Play it. You will learn probably a lot more than you will from a lecture about dementia, I'll just say. So thank you guys for taking the time to build this game so thoughtfully.
Oh wow, that's incredible. Thank you. And it's probably worth mentioning at the moment we every sale of the game, a portion of the price of the game goes to Alzheimer's Research UK. So that's up until the 4th of October. So if people buy now, they also donate to Alzheimer's Research.
Great. Yes, go get this game. It's on Steam. Is that the only place right now to pick it up?
And it's on Itch.
On Itch?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Go check that out and follow Threefold Games. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more interesting things coming out of that studio. Great. Great. Thanks, everyone, so much for coming along. Thank you, Chella. Thank you, Claire. We will see you next time. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button. We're so thrilled with the momentum we have at digital.games. Let's keep it going. If you like this video, if you like what we're doing, share, talk about us on Twitter, talk to us, and also feel free to come hang out with me on Twitch this Wednesday night. All right, see you next time, and game on.